Hello, fellow Planeswalkers, it's Scott, and welcome to today's previews for the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. It's day 4 previews. We got a bunch of cards to talk about today that look to have an impact on Standard and in other formats. But before we get started, special thanks to Caffeinated Gamer for sponsoring this video, and remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout the Lost Caverns of Ixalan spoiler season. So let's get started. So first we've got Restless Anchorage and Restless Ridgeline. So Restless Anchorage is our white and blue creature land. Until end of turn, Restless Anchorage becomes a 2/3 white and blue bird creature with flying. It's still a land. Whenever Restless Anchorage attacks, create a map token. So I think so far this is, certainly the cheapest of the ones we've gotten so far from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. In the fact that it's an evasive card, I think makes it a very good card to use. So I can see the Soldiers deck or the Azorius aggro deck that we've got out there wanting to put a couple copies of this in there. And I think some other decks like Esper might want to do that as well. Next, we've got the Restless Ridgeline. Okay, this is our red and green mana dual land, and for 4 mana, Restless Ridgeline becomes a 3/4 red and green dinosaur creature until end of turn. It's still a land. And whenever Restless Ridgeline attacks, another target creature gets +2 until end of turn. Untap that creature. Restless Ridgeline, I think, is going to go into the Gruul Dinosaur deck that it looks like is going to be forming from the cards we're getting from the set. And it'll be a very positive piece to that. Because it's going to help other cards also in the set to be a little bit better by giving that attack trigger to one of your creatures, hopefully something that's got trample, and untapping it will also help because then you give yourself a blocker. So these, I think, are 2 very playable lands that we're going to see throughout the next 3 years of Standard. Next, we've got Tishana's Tidebinder. For 2 and a blue mana, you get a Merfolk Wizard. That's a 3/2 with flash. And when Tishana's Tidebinder enters the battlefield, counter target activated or triggered ability. If an ability from an artifact, creature, or planeswalker is countered this way, that permanent loses all abilities for as long as Tishana's Tidebinder remains on the battlefield. So this is potentially one of the most, if not the most powerful potential card in this set, because the ability to turn off a planeswalker if you flash Tishana's Tidebinder in when your opponent is activating an ability of a planeswalker, it counters that activation. But more importantly, what it also is going to do is, while Tishana's Tidebinder is in play, that planeswalker no longer can activate any loyalty abilities. And the same thing will be said from a creature that when it comes into play, it may have an activated ability. You can shut those abilities off while Tishana's Tidebinder is in play. And also with artifacts as well. And we know we're going to see a lot of artifacts because of what we're seeing in this set. So I think this is a very, very good Standard card. And it has Modern and Pioneer applications as well. So I think we're going to see a lot of this in the future. Next we have Inti, Seneschal of the Sun. For 1 and a red mana, you get a legendary creature that's a human knight and is a 2/2. And whenever you attack, you may discard a card. When you do, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. It gains trample until the end of turn. So there's one ability, but it also has, Inti has another one. Whenever you discard 1 or more cards, exile the top card of your library. You may play it until your next end step. So this is probably so far the best red card we've seen. 2-drop that has the ability to grow very quickly. You can discard a card, and then when you do, you get to loot for that by getting to look at getting the next card on the top of your library at that point, and you can filter through your deck fairly quickly with Inti. And the nice thing about this is it does not matter if Inti is a creature attacking. Any attacking creature will activate the ability. So I think in mono red decks, this will probably be a 2 or 3 of, because that ability to discard something, put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature, and gaining the trample is a really solid ability for red and something that red decks are looking for. And red decks are always looking to exile cards and then be able to play them on that same turn. So I think the combination of abilities here is going to be something that is a very, very solid card in Standard in red decks, and it probably goes beyond the mono red deck. Next, we've got another god from the set in Ojer Pakpatiq, Deepest Epoch. For 2 and 2 blue mana, you get a legendary god with flying. That's a 4/3. And whenever you cast an instant spell from your hand, it gains rebound. Exile it as it resolves. At the beginning of your next upkeep, you may cast it from exile without paying its mana cost. So incredibly powerful ability there on this card, where you're going to be able to recast all your instants and sorceries as long as Ojer is on the field. And then when Ojer Pakpatiq dies, return it to the battlefield tapped and transform under its owner's control with 3 time counters on it. Then you get Temple of Cyclical Time. It's a land, and you can add blue mana, and each time you tap it for mana, you remove a time counter from the Temple of Cyclical Time. And then for 3 mana, you can transform Temple of Cyclical Time, but you can only activate this if you have no time counters on it and only as a sorcery. So the way I'm looking at this is that if it dies, it transforms, you put the 3 time counters on it, and you're probably using this for 3 straight turns to remove those time counters on it, and then it's going to come back on that 3rd turn and be in play again, and then you're going to get those abilities again. So I think, in my mind, because this is legendary, any of our spells decks are going to want this because that rebound ability is really powerful, and I see this as something that's going to see a decent amount of standard play going forward. Next, we've got Resplendent Angel, another reprint from the set. For 3 mana, you get an angel with flying. That's a 3/3. And at the beginning of each end step, if you gain 5 or more life this turn, create a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying and vigilance. And for 6 mana until end of turn, Resplendent Angel gets +2/+2 and gains lifelink. So Resplendent Angel was a good card the first time around it was in Standard. And my anticipation is, because we've got so many angels already in Standard, that this could be, in essence, become a nice piece to add to what is already a solid angel deck in Standard. And if we look at older formats, Resplendent Angel is already a key piece of the angel deck in Pioneer. So I would expect this to be something that we're going to see in Standard and see some pretty good play with it. Next, we've got Brass's Tunnel Grinder. For 2 and a red mana, you get a legendary artifact. When Brass's Tunnel Grinder enters the battlefield, discard any number of cards, then draw that many +1. So when it comes into play, you basically get to draw a card, and if you've got other cards you want to get rid of, you can do that as well. And then at the beginning of your end step, if you descended this turn, put a bore counter on Brass Tunnel Grinder. Then if there are 3 or more bore counters on it, remove those counters and transform it. You get Ixalan, the Searing Rift. It's a legendary land, it's a cave, and it adds red mana. But the exciting thing about the card, and I think this is why we'll see Standard play, is that whenever you cast a permanent spell using mana produced by Ixalan, the Searing Rift, discover X, where X is the spell's mana value. So once it's transformed, what you'll be able to do is you're going to discover turn after turn after turn, and when you play a card, basically you're getting the opportunity to get another card of equal value onto the battlefield. And that kind of ability is in some ways absurd if you think about it for a minute, because basically you're casting something, say, for 3 or 4 mana, and then you're going to get a card that's 1, 2, 4, or 5 mana, and that's a powerful ability. And if you're doing this turn after turn, it's going to put your opponent in a tough situation, because you're just going to keep building and building, and it's going to be hard for them to slow you down unless they can get rid of this land. Next, we've got Kite Sail Larcenist. For 2 and a blue mana, you get a human pirate. That's a 2/3 with flying and ward 1. And when Kite Sail Larcenist enters the battlefield, for each player, choose up to one other target artifact or creature that player controls. For as long as Kite Sail Larcenist remains on the battlefield, choose the chosen permanent becomes a treasure artifact with sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color, and lose all other abilities. So Kite Sail Larcenist to me is a card that I think is going to see play, because what it does is it shuts off a creature's triggered abilities. Like Shealdra's triggered abilities, you choose that when Kite Sail Larcenist comes into play. Now Shealdra doesn't do anything in terms of abilities because it's now a treasure. It can't block either because it's a treasure. And the ability for blue to do that, even if it's just temporarily, I think is a very solid ability. And blue seems to be getting a little bit stronger as we go. And we already have seen some quality pirates. So definitely this would be in any pirate deck that we would expect to see this standard season and beyond. Next, we've got Scytheclaw Raptor. For 2 and a red mana, you get a 4/3 dinosaur. And then whenever a player casts a spell, if it isn't their turn, Scytheclaw Raptor deals 4 damage to them. So in my mind, this is a sideboard card in any red deck, especially if you're playing against a lot of, because we're definitely seeing more and more flash cards. We're seeing a lot of people playing instants and sorceries that they want to play on your turn so they can keep up counter spells or the like. But what Scytheclaw Raptor does is it makes that very painful for them when that would occur. So to me, this is definitely a sideboard card in any red deck I might be playing, because the ability to do damage to my opponent on my turn just because they're playing something, whether it's to kill this or something else, that's a really powerful ability. And a 4/3 for 3 mana is good anyways. So I think this has definite standard playability. Definitely the dinosaur deck will want to, probably a piece of this card, and we'll see how far it spreads beyond that. But I think most of the decks that are going to be red are going to want to see this around, because there's enough things that happen where your opponent's trying to play on your turn that this will be valuable. Next, we have Subterranean Schooner. For 1 and a blue mana, you get a vehicle. That's a 3/4. And whenever Subterranean Schooner attacks, target creature that crewed it this turn explores. So the creature that you crewed Subterranean Schooner with, you're going to go ahead and explore with it. So I think that's a pretty nice ability. And we've got a lot of 1/1s and 1/2s and 2/1s that we might want to use it, cast it on turn 2. On turn 3, we use one of those to crew it. They get to explore, grow a little bit bigger, and give a bigger threat later in the game. So I think this has some standard playability, but again, it's going to take the right deck for that to occur. Next, we've got Helping Hand. For 1 white mana, you get a sorcery, and return target creature card with mana 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So this is a really cool ability. Usually this is costing 2 mana or 3 mana to do this. So 1 mana to return a 3-drop creature to the battlefield is really nice. And I can see any white deck wanting this in some a couple of in the sideboard, possibly main decking some, depending on where the format goes, because that ability to just go get your best card that your opponent killed out of the graveyard is really nice, a really nice ability that hopefully can lead to you coming back in a game and potentially winning it. Next, we have Queen's Bay Paladin. For 3 and 2 black mana, you get a Vampire Knight. That's a 5/4. And whenever Queen's Bay Paladin enters the battlefield or attacks, return up to 1 target vampire card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. You lose life equal to its mana value. So Queen's Bay Paladin, to me, is kind of the top end potentially of a vampire deck, where you might have a couple copies of it as a way of, creating a recursive nature for your vampires that have already died. And there's enough vampires that are flyers that I think this definitely has a place in that deck, but it's probably only a 1 or 2 of. All right, next we've got Braided Net. Braided Net's an artifact, and when Braided Net enters the battlefield with 3 net counters on it, and you can tap it to remove a net counter from Braided Net, tap another target non-land permanent. Its activated abilities can't be activated for as long as it remains tapped. So I really like the ability on this card because this allows you to potentially use something on your opponent's turn, maybe on their upkeep, to tap down a planeswalker that's problematic or a creature that's problematic, and that creature also loses all of their abilities. That planeswalker loses all their abilities as long as it remains tapped. And I think that's a nice ability in Standard to just kind of shut down the best thing that your opponent has. Now it also has Craft, and Craft with Artifact, and for 1 and a blue mana, once you've exhausted your 3 net counters, you go ahead and craft it. Then you get Braided Quiapu. It's an artifact, and for 4 mana you can tap and draw a card for each artifact you control, then put Braided Quinop into its owner's library, 3rd from the top. So this also has this kind of recursive nature to it, where you're drawing a card, you're putting it back in, and then a couple turns later you're going to get it back and be able to do the same thing over again, which I think makes this definitely something that people will want to consider in blue decks, because that ability to, you know, shut something down for 3 turns, and then on the backside your ability to go ahead and draw cards equal to the number of artifacts you've got in play. I think that combination of abilities is a nice package, and it has standard playability. Next, we've got some lower rarity cards, but I want to talk about these specifically because they're dinosaurs. First, we've got Nurturing Bristleback for 5 and 2 green mana. You get a dinosaur, that's a 5/5. And when Nurturing Bristleback enters the battlefield, you get to create a 3/3 green dinosaur creature token. And it also has Forest Cycling for 2. Now, I'm bringing this card up specifically because it has Forest Cycling. I think that the dinosaur deck we're going to see is one that's going to want to ramp some. And Nurturing Bristleback might be a couple copies in your deck, so that way, if you get it early in the game, you're going to use it to cycle, and then late in the game, when you've got that 7 mana, you're going to get a 5/5 and a 2/3, so putting 2 bodies on the board, and that should help hopefully finish off the game at that point. Now, our next card is Earthshaker Dreadmaw for 4 and 2 green mana. You get a dinosaur, that's a 6/6, and has Trample. And what excites me about this card is when Earthshaker Dreadmaw enters the battlefield, draw a card for each other dinosaur you control. So in a dedicated dinosaur deck, you're going to get 2, 3, 4 cards, potentially even more off of this when you cast it for 6 mana. And that's a really powerful ability in the mid to late game to basically refill your hand and be able to deal with your opponent's threats as you push through, hopefully, the final damage to win the game. Finally, we've got Compass Gnome. For 2 mana, you get an artifact creature that's a gnome. It's a 2/1, and what is interesting about it to me, and I think makes it playable in Standard, even though it's a common, is when Compass Gnome enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land or a cave card, reveal it, then shuffle, and put that card on top. So while you don't get to draw the land, you do get to go ahead and sculpt the top of your deck, so you get a cave, you get a basic land that you're going to want to use. Because one of the things that always is problematic for some of the decks that want to really go fast is they get mana shorted, and putting this card in your deck as a way of ensuring that 3rd mana may be a very nice thing in Standard. And a 2/1 isn't terrible, and we do have other abilities that can help boost it. And I think that makes it playable in Standard, potentially even in an artifact deck that I think we're going to develop based on what we're seeing from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. All right, so that's it for today. Day 4 is down of the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. Over the next couple of days, because it's the weekend, we're going to see a little bit of a slowdown in cards. So I'll probably be back with some shorter videos over the weekend, highlighting the key cards that come out from that time frame. Thanks for staying to the end of the video. Please remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout the Lost Caverns of Ixalan season, and to get our content, help get our content out to more viewers. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.